I'm doing my part. We meet up with a lot of space bugs in Atari Archive's new episode. First up, a mea culpa. Chopper Command will actually come up in the next episode. After commenter Kate Track asked about the May date I had for that game, I double-checked my sources from when I was looking up release info and could not figure out where I got May from. All evidence points to June, so June is when we'll contend with it. But this actually works out thematically, as for whatever cosmic coincidence, the other May releases both focus on insects in space. And leading us off is Yars Revenge, the first game from Howard Scott Warshaw. Perhaps better known for his wildly ambitious Raiders of the Lost Ark and E.T. the Extraterrestrial games, which sought to build on the mechanics laid out in games such as Adventure and Haunted House, Yars Revenge is ambitious in a different manner. The original game was, at the very beginning, supposed to be a home conversion of Cinematronics' arcade title Star Castle. For the unfamiliar, Star Castle is a vector-based shooter with the sort of 360-degree free-range movement you'd find in Asteroids or Space War. The brainchild of designer Tim Skelly and programmed by Scott Bowden, you control a little fighter with the goal of destroying an enemy base in the center of the screen protected by a shield. According to historian Keith Smith's unreleased book All in Color for a Quarter, the idea had come to Skelly in 1979 when he'd seen a strange game under development by Dan Sunday at Vectorbeam, a subsidiary at Cinematronics. Titled Oops, it was a game about contraceptives, with an egg in the center of the screen and a screen full of sperm cells, with one player controlling one specific sperm that all the others would copy the movements of. The second player had to protect the egg using spermicidal foam using a rotating cylinder in the center of the screen. Since this concept was, frankly, too adult for arcade spaces, the reproductive cells were traded out for outer space action, and the shield added. This base shielding consists of 3 rotating layers, and as you pepper a given segment of shield, it will fail. You need to pick your way through these shields without dropping a layer entirely, as that will cause the base to generate a replacement. Stymieing your efforts are little homing fireballs you can try and destroy, and of course the base itself. It features a cannon that is always rotating to point at you, and once you've opened a potential hole, it will fire given the opportunity. As such, you're always on the move, trying to avoid the fireballs and the cannon, while angling for a clear shot yourself. Star Castle sold about 14,000 units, making it Cinematronics' most successful game, and the most likely one for a person to come across at an arcade even today. It even received a very accurate conversion to the Vectrex game console in October 1983. Needless to say, this concept is difficult for the VCS hardware. While homebrew authors have managed to twice in the console's aftermarket years, this was not so easy a task in the early 1980s for Warshaw, who had just started at Atari and had only a few days to orient himself with the VCS programmer's manual. According to Warshaw's excellent book Once Upon Atari, How I Made History by Killing an Industry, upon starting, his 3 goals were to make a splash in terms of design, a game with a distinctive sensory experience, and one that would be fresh and innovative. A Star Castle conversion would achieve none of these, he reasoned, as it would be nightmarish to reproduce its design on the VCS, play poorly even with the successful conversion, look monotonous, and at best be a reflection of an actual arcade experience. After about a week, he spoke to Dennis Coble, then head of Atari's home game development division, and pitched him on taking the basic idea of Star Castle and making a whole new game with it instead. Coble was receptive, and so Warshaw had the green light to create what would become today's game. According to his book, Warshaw's initial prototype, which he called Time Freeze, retained the asteroid-style control and movement of Star Castle, with left and right rotating the player's little bug graphic, up thrusting forward, and down loading a cannon that is used to destroy the enemy base. He didn't find this approach particularly fun, however. He credits the adjustments to the control scheme to what the final game uses to an anonymous department director who soon became his new boss. Based on the timeline of events, this was possibly Steve Wright, who assumed Dennis Coble's role as director of software development, but I can't say this for sure. In the process, Warshaw dropped the variable speed and inertia of the original prototype, and after some brainstorming, came up with a new approach to loading the cannon. Now the player could load the cannon by bumping up against the base's shield to steal energy instead of simply shooting it. If you're out of shield, he reasoned, you could touch the enemy base, which could bring its own risk-reward, as the base could fire off its own super weapon at any moment. Finally, Warshaw added in a neutral zone element in the middle of the screen to fill blank space. This rainbow-colored, shifting field is made up of the game's code, which meant Warshaw didn't need to use any additional program space to build it because the graphics code being used was already there. The final variation of this was used in the screen-filling explosion graphic upon the base's destruction, where graphics code slowly shrinks away to nothing. From there, Warshaw refined the game, tweaking elements. In a Retro Gamer interview, Warshaw delved into the audio design behind Yars Revenge as well, indicating his desire to create tension and mood within the confines of the VCS sound hardware. Unusually, Warshaw was also pretty involved in the name and lore of the game, submitting Yars Revenge as a title, Yar being named after Ray Kassar, Atari's then CEO, as is the Razak solar system it's set in, which, after slightly informing the marketing rep of this, saw the game's title approved. For his submission to the marketing folks, he ended up writing a 12-page backstory for the game that informed the game's manual and marketing descriptions. Yars Revenge was also subjected to a fair bit of product testing, including a full-on focus test using Missile Command, which Warshaw considered the best game on the VCS as the control title. The end result, he wrote in his book, was Yars Revenge outperforming Missile Command with over 100 plus testers as data points. In his Retro Gamer comments, Warshaw mused that the game tested better with women and girls, but despite this, the commercials focused in on boys. In all, Yars Revenge saw 7 months of development and another 5 of testing, Warshaw writes. The core game loop of Yars Revenge comes down to destroying enough of the quotile shield that you can fire the Zorlon cannon at the core itself, destroying it. Working to stop you, the quotile sends out a destroyer missile, which will seek out your location. The neutral zone band, made up of graphical game code, makes you immune to the missile, but at the same time you aren't able to fire your gun or the Zorlon cannon while you're in there. The quotile itself will attack directly periodically too, turning into the swirl every so often and flying out after a random period of time to try and ram you. While your shots can destroy the shield, so too can physically going up and eating it, and this will charge the Zorlon cannon on the left side of the screen. And you could also charge it by touching the quotile, though this is risky since it'll kill you if it shifts to its swirl state. Hitting the quotile or swirl with the cannon's shot, which will be aligned on your current vertical position when you fire it, causes a screen-wide explosion and entry to the next round. The quotile shield alternates between a static half-circle and a constantly moving rectangle that makes it harder to cut through. And with each round, the destroyer missile gets faster, the swirl charges up more quickly, and eventually the neutral zone itself vanishes in some waves. The shield itself also changes color, which according to the manual signifies hitting a high score threshold. These color changes denote new swirl actions, including an increase in frequency, sometimes firing instantly, and changing direction mid-flight to wallop the Yar more effectively. Yars Revenge features the usual array of VCS game types, each one ramping up the complexity of the action. The basic game mode, Game 0, is advertised as the children-friendly one, with a slow destroyer missile and fairly relaxed gameplay. Game 2 speeds up the destroyer missile and the swirl attack. Game 4 has that additional speed, plus the Zorlon cannon will now bounce off the shield if it misses the quotile, and returns towards the left side of the screen. And it is just as deadly to the Yar on its return flight as it is when fired. Game 6, considered Ultimate Yars, requires you to physically load the Zorlon cannon by collecting at least 5 units of energy, called Trons, and touching the left side of the screen. Eating a piece of the shield gives you 1 Tron, touching the quotile gives you 2, and catching the Zorlon cannon on the rebound from the shield provides 4. All of these game modes include both 1 and 2 player options. The difficulty switches also affect the game. When set to A, it will speed up the swirl's attack velocity and also make the destroyer missile capable of cancelling out the Zorlon shot. While you do earn 69 points per block of shield shot by the Yar, you get an additional 100 bonus points for eating a block and varying point values for destroying the quotile, depending on when you do it. These range from 1,000 points while it's docile at its base, to 6,000 points and an extra life when it's a swirl in flight. You do get the sense that Ultimate Yars on games 6 and 7 are how Warshaw really intended the game to be played. The action of collecting fuel to manually load the Zorlon cannon itself really adds another layer of complexity to the game's play loop, which makes things particularly interesting on higher stages when you have no safe zone and a very aggressive destroyer missile. Playing with difficulty A is quite welcome too, giving the quotile a bit of a defender with the missile being able to block Zorlon shots. Amusingly, if you destroy the missile while the quotile is in swirl form, it won't fire a new destroyer missile off until it's back to normal. Even without these gameplay wrinkles, however, Yars Revenge is quite approachable, and really does have game modes for every level of skill and interest. We also have another Easter egg squirreled away in this game. You may notice that when the quotile is destroyed, a vertical black line appears in the explosion wherever it was destroyed. This is called the Ghost of Yars in the manual, where you're advised to give it a wide berth. Well, by destroying a swirl mid-flight and then aligning the black dot on the Yar with the Ghost of Yars on the lower third of the screen, you'll soft lock your run and bring up HSWWSH, which stands for Howard Scott Warshaw. This also means the end of the game, so generally speaking, if you're playing for a high score, or to see how far you can get, it's best to do as the manual says and avoid the black line. It does appear that Warshaw had originally intended a much more complex approach to accessing his initials that likely no one would have done by accident, whereas this is absolutely something kids could have triggered at the time and been very confused by. Interestingly, Warshaw also snuck the Yar into his following VCS games as an Easter egg as a nice indicator of where he started.
From Yars Revenge, which was
Also unusually, Yars Revenge included a full-color comic book with the cartridge. This book detailed the backstory to the game that Warshaw developed and the war they were purportedly fighting as a space bug. This is the first such comic produced for a VCS game, or possibly any video game, and appears to have largely been the result of in-house talent. Written by Hope Schaefer and illustrated by Atari artists Hiro Kimura and Ray Garst, with assistance from Frank Sirocco, the comic delves into the terrestrial origins of the Yars and a colorful explanation of the game's mechanics. Notably, this is the first time Atari actively gave a designer credit for a VCS game, as Warshaw's name is front and center in the comic's credits as the game programmer. Given the play loop involved in Yars Revenge, this is a clever way to explain it to kids how to actually win, and paved the way for similar comics to be included with other 1982 and 1983 VCS releases, as well as the Sword Quest games. Much stranger is the Yars Revenge vinyl album. This, as well as similar albums for Asteroids and Missile Command, licensed out the Kids Stuff record label, has a retelling of the game's backstory alongside a few musical tracks describing the Quotile War and its aftermath. This appears to have been produced by singer-songwriter John Braden, who passed away in 1987. There was a whole slew of these sorts of video game albums at the time, and this was probably one of the better ones. Yars Revenge was pretty heavily advertised with television commercials, promotional items, and even an ad for movie theaters. Yars was reviewed surprisingly average at the time given its modern reputation as a VCS gem. Electronic Games hints at their thoughts on Yars Revenge in their review of Defender, calling it decidedly mediocre, before delving into it in detail in the October 1982 issue. While heaping praise on the game's setting, graphical elements, audio design, and ease of understanding, they simply note that the game's sole objective is repetitive in an era when progressive challenges and stages were becoming the norm. Joystick published its review scores alongside a strategy section in its December 1982 edition before following up with a review in January. There, they seemingly echo the views of Electronic Games that Yars is graphically impressive, but not a game with much longevity to it for adults, though, they add, it should be appealing to kids. And honestly, even though it is a very solid game, these critiques are certainly fair ones, making it all the more sensible to approach the higher difficulty levels to keep things interesting. Yars Revenge was the 19th best-selling VCS game according to the partial image of Jerome Domerat's internal sales memo Warshaw included in his Once Upon Atari documentary in 2003, but unfortunately it cuts off any actual figures. We do have sales figures for Atari's 1986 through 1990 sales period, where Yars Revenge sold, both domestically and internationally, approximately 39,947 units, with over half of those in 1989 alone. We do know that Video Takeout, the progenitors of the Video Game Update / Computer Entertainer newsletter, had it marked as among their best-selling games that summer, though it fell off the charts by their September issue. When Billboard started tracking the best-selling home video games in late September after a nearly 6-month break, Yars Revenge was consistently in the mid-range of the charts, generally between the 7th and 11th best-selling game through October, though it fell off shortly afterwards. This suggests steady, solid sales in the summer months, even in the absence of solid numbers. The game was enough of a hit that Atari coin-op developer Dave Toyer suggested to Warshaw that it might be a good fit for an arcade conversion, though this never came together. As one of Atari's most noteworthy original IPs, Yars Revenge has been revisited a few times since. There is a Game Boy Color title written by Mike Mika, now head of Digital Eclipse, which expands on the base game loop in a few ways but is otherwise quite faithful. It returned in 2005 as the buggy and somewhat lackluster Yars Return as a homebrew release on the Atari Flashback 2 console, which is functionally a hack of Yars Revenge that mirrors the shield on both sides of the screen and allows you to load a Zorlon cannon on either side. In 2011, there was a tangentially related Xbox Live game more in line with the Sega's Panzer Dragoon, and as of the last couple years, the Yar have returned with Yars Revenge Recharged, which adds in twin-stick controls and power-ups, and Yars Revenge Enhanced on the Atari 50 collection, which plays much more closely to the original. The original Yars Revenge stands the test of time, however. This is one of those VCS games that is fairly easy to intuit how it works with a little playtime and experimentation, and even if you're not exploring the higher game modes, you can still find a fair bit of fun from it. Warshaw's following two games are decidedly more polarizing, but Yars Revenge is a standout on the platform and cemented him as a thoughtful game designer for years to come. Besides Yars Revenge, May also saw the release of the second game from Computer Magic, now going by CommaVid, Cosmic Swarm. If you don't remember CommaVid very well, they were a small operation based out of Illinois founded by a trio of physicists. In 1981, they published the Magic Card through Hobbyist Magazines, a fairly robust assembly programming cartridge for the VCS. With Cosmic Swarm, the company makes its debut into mass-market sales with a game that, while not visually incredible, really sets the tone for the sort of inventive gameplay that CommaVid would be known for. CommaVid's three founders and designers have proven difficult for me to get in touch with, and the last bit of historical press they seem to have done was back in 2003 with the then operators of the Classic Gaming Expo, now co-founders of the US National Video Game Museum, where it's likely that any materials from these designers now reside in storage. As a result, much of what we do know about CommaVid stems from the webpage Joe Santulli put up about that visit at the time. Dr. John Bronstein was the designer behind Cosmic Swarm, as well as the Magic Card. According to Santulli, Bronstein's notes indicated that the game was originally to be called Termite and feature an insect theme, but after consulting with some marketing friends, Bronstein invented the outer space story that appears on the game's final packaging, though it still doesn't stray too far from being about bugs. A benefit to low-resolution Atari graphics, of course, is you don't necessarily need to tweak too much to retool it in that way. Cosmic Swarm's funky box art was done by a local Chicago area artist with experience designing arcade graphics for the local Chicago area coin-op companies, though Santulli doesn't mention her by name, and possibly neither did the CommaVid folks. It appears they weren't wholly satisfied with her work, as all their other games' cover art was done by a different designer, and Cosmic Swarm itself received new art in its international run. As for Cosmic Swarm itself, like Yars Revenge, it is taking a concept of a free-range shooter and putting its own twist on it. Here you're dealing with giant space termites that are dropping off blocks on screen. The termites can be destroyed with your ship's cannon, but the blocks are invincible, unless you shoot a block held by a termite. This destroys both of them and energizes all blocks on screen. In practice, this changes all the existing block colors from green to red, and at this point they can be destroyed until you shoot another termite. Every so often you'll hear an alarm siren and a refueling ship will come wobbling down one of the sides of the screen. If you fail to refuel or destroy the ship before doing so, the game ends, regardless of how many lives you may have left. You do earn an extra life for every 100 points, with the destroyed termites and blocks and even the refueling ship being worth 1 or 2 points apiece. You actually have a fair bit of control over where you aim too, as Cosmic Swarm takes the unusual step of letting you rotate your ship while holding down the fire button. Letting go of the button is what actually makes you fire your cannon. The select switch doesn't do anything in this game, but the difficulty switches adjust how quickly the termites will move around and how aggressive they'll be in pursuing the player themselves, respectively. Despite the rather lackluster appearance, the termites are pretty goofy looking and the player's ship seems ripped directly from asteroids. Cosmic Swarm doesn't play at all like anything else available at the time. The default difficulty BB mode is relatively relaxed, but flipping one or both switches to difficulty A makes things a bit more chaotic and difficult to manage. You're constantly needing to shift your attention to prioritize new threats and what's happening on screen, and God help you if you accidentally shoot the refueling ship. At the same time, it is rather exhausting to play on the standard VCS controller, as you're constantly pushing and holding the button, flying around the screen, without much of a break. It's an interesting take on a single-screen shooter, and a solid entry for CommaVid. CommaVid's new offering was mostly, albeit not universally, well received at the time. Electronic Games editors Bill Kunkel and Arnie Katz wrote in its August 1982 edition that Cosmic Swarm's graphics were fairly straightforward, but well suited to the game's concept, which was in turn very clever. They felt that Cosmic Swarm was a darn good idea for a game, and spoke at length about its unique mechanics and playstyle for what is ostensibly a shooter. The pair delved into it further in the pages of Video Magazine's July 1982 edition, calling it a workmanlike video game that features adequate sound and graphics with such an ingenious game mechanic that it lifts the entire effort up. They recommended the game particularly for longer play sessions where its non-repetitive nature can shine, and called it an excellent first effort from CommaVid, which in terms of mass market sales is true. Creative Computing's Video Arcade Games edition from September 1983 also reviewed the game positively, noting that it requires both shooting skill and strategic thinking to fend off the space termites. This combination of action and thoughtfulness, they wrote, makes it a good addition to the VCS library. Joystick was a bit less positive on Cosmic Swarm, noting that it mixes up aspects of Space Invaders, Pac-Man, Centipede, and Asteroids, and with a nice spread of difficulty options for players, but it also grows boring once the player understands how to blast the blocks. Video and Computer Games had 2 reviewers on this game. The first remarked that the mix of Asteroids and Centipede aspects resulted in an impressive, albeit poorly named game quite unlike any other, while the other found it paled in comparison to Data Age's Bugs, a game that came out in October 1982 with too many gameplay mechanics to keep track of. Martin Trost, writing for Electronic Fun with Computers and Games, didn't particularly like Cosmic Swarm, finding the graphics and scoring simplistic, the graphics uninspiring, and the controls overly complex. The Logical Gamer reviewers split on Cosmic Swarm, with one finding it appealing for those looking for a shooting game with something extra, the other finding it dull, if not outright boring. CommaVid gained a reputation in the coming months for games that were interesting and typically quite good, conceptually and graphically. Cosmic Swarm may not show off the latter very well, but even at this early stage you can get a good idea of what to expect out of CommaVid going forward. Next time, we're defending the little guys.